Do you sometimes have trouble starting an art journal page or a painting project? I mean, some days it can be a bit overwhelming and you end up doing nothing, or maybe you just can't get in the mood. You know you want to do something but you're not quite sure what it is. Well, I'm sharing 12 of my favourite tips for using acrylic paints to help you out on those days and get you making quick, expressive and fearless art. And if you're new to my channel, then don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more art and craft, inspiration, tips and tricks videos every week. Right, let's get started, shall we? So, tip number 1, throw pretty and beautiful out of the window. You know, sometimes there's just too much pressure on trying to make something that's gonna look great, and you need to be thinking more about experimental and interesting. So take the pressure off from having to produce something that you're gonna put up on Instagram and just throw some paint at it. The worst that can happen is that you end up covering it up later, so it's no big deal really. And if you take some of that fear away of, oh, what if I make something ugly, or what if I make a mistake, if you take that away, then it's just a lot easier to do something. So for this kind of work, it is good to practice just doing and not thinking. And this is from somebody who overthinks everything. I've said before in my videos, I am an overthinker. So if you are too, here's another tip that will help you. Tip number 2, pick a limited colour palette. So pick 3 to 4 colours that you know will mix well together, and then you won't have to worry about mixing muddy colours. So I've got a yellow, green, blue and Payne's grey here in my palette today, but I've also been a little bit cheeky and I've added in a white too, as this is quite a useful way of making tones to stretch that colour palette. And also I'm using it to knock back and cover pages very quickly instead of using gesso, where I'd have to wait for the gesso to dry. Because the aim of today is to be quick and expressive. I'll list the exact name of the colours that I've used in the description below. These starter pages are also great for testing out colour combos, so don't be afraid to pick colours you'd usually shy away from. Next tip. Tip number 3, use a palette knife, or some sort of tool that will put on a lot of paint very quickly, and palette knives are great for this. But you can also use plastic cards like old gift cards, and you've probably seen me use those quite a lot too. But palette knives are really useful. You can get them in all sorts of shapes and sizes, plus they're a really expressive way of getting paint down, as you can use them to make bold marks or for covering large areas, and you'll see different ways of using them as we go along. Tip number 4, mix your colours on your page. And you'll see I'm doing a lot of that in today's exercise. It's just a really great way of taking some of the thought process out of it, and you just put the paint onto the page and mix it there, and it's kind of immediate. And you'll get different colours coming through, which is part of the fun of it. And it also leads us nicely on to tip number 5, and that is, don't clean your tools. Did you all gasp at that one? I'm sure I heard you all gasp. Okay, let me go into more detail. So the knife that I'm using to apply the paint and also to mix it and make my marks with, I'm not cleaning that between pages. As I've already said, we've picked colours that will mix well together, so any colour that's left from page to page on that palette knife will only add interest to another page. I am, however, using clean palette knives when I'm taking out the paint from the pots. So yeah, go ahead and clean those. You don't want to contaminate any of your paint pots. But the one you're using for drawing with, for making marks with, for mixing with, and putting on the paper, don't clean them, just use them as they are. You only really need to clean them up at the end of your painting session for this particular type of exercise. And just to demonstrate how much we're not going to worry about cleaning off our mark makers between pages, tip number 6, press your pages together. So take wet pages and press them to each other. So that could be opposite pages in the same book, or perhaps pages from different books. Press the wet pages together, then carefully peel them apart again, and you'll get some fun printed impressions. And if you want to add lots of texture, then try tip number 7, which is to go thicker. So apply your paint thickly and use heavy body acrylic paint, because that's just perfect for this. So you can see I'm leaving great swathes of it in places, so it's nice and thick. And this time I'm going to use a completely fresh, untouched page from my junk journal to press into this paint. But you could still use a page that you've already got paint on it, that's fine. But this way I've started 2 double pages with just 1 paint application. Yay me! See, even quicker quick start to art journaling. And what I particularly like about this technique is the texture that you get. And you know yourself, when you've pressed something into wet paint and pulled it up, you get that lovely branching effect. And it's a great bit of texture to put down at the beginning of a page, because as you add layers on top, it will just add even more interest. And I've got a video that shows you how to really harness that, and I'll link that up in the cards and in the description below. Right, we're just over halfway through my tips. So have I covered any that you already use, or perhaps there's ones that you haven't tried yet and you're thinking about adding them to your practice? Let me know, I would love to hear in the comments below. Plus feel free to add any tips of your own to help others get their art journals started and using acrylic paint. If you are finding this video useful, then please do share it and also like it as well, that would be great, thank you. Okay, tip number 8. Go for quick loose shapes. Now this one might be one of my favourite tips because this is super expressive. So again, don't overthink it, just get some paint down and start drawing shapes with it. So I'm going to use circles because I kind of like circles. I mean, a circle's a great shape, isn't it? I've put a layer of white down and that's also helping. I'm just working in that still wet, so I'm getting different tones every time I move the paint. And for this I'm using a paintbrush, but you could do this with a palette knife as well if you liked. It's all a bit rough and ready, and I'm just layering the circles on top of each other until I've got a nice full page of circles. So whatever shape you like, just do that. Just fill your whole page with that shape. And I've even introduced another colour into it, and I've left some of the areas thick and some of the areas thin, so you can vary it up. It's also a good idea to work fairly quickly on it and try not to design where the circles go, just put them down. Tip number 9 is on a similar lines to the page pressing from tip number 6, but this time you don't even have to spread the paint out. Just add it to the page from the tube or the jar and press another page into it. Now I've gone for soft body paint for this one, and you can have loads of fun squeezing the paint between the pages to get all sorts of different ink blot type patterns. But I'm going to carry on spreading mine out with my palette knife, ready for tip number 10, which is inclusions. So cut out the middleman of glues, gels and mediums and just add your bits and pieces into the wet acrylic paint that you've just put down. Once it's dry, it acts exactly the same as if you'd use a gel or a medium or a glue, and it will glue that piece to your page. So I've got some old book pages that I'm adding to my page, and thin layers of paint are really good for things like tissues and papers. But if you use a thicker layer of paint, you can also add thicker inclusions, things like buttons, safety pins, all sorts of things, so give it a go. Are you ready for the penultimate tip? And it's another great one for getting really expressive starts to your pages, plus adding lots of texture too. It's tip number 11, and scrape draw in the paint. I feel like I'm doing a music chart countdown, or in this case it would be a count up. So for this starter page demo, I've covered the page with white paint again, and I've added my colour straight to it, and whilst the white paint is still wet, I've just mixed all the colours together on the page. Now I'm keeping the paint a little bit thicker because I want to scrape draw a loose design in the paint with my palette knife. And you could of course also use a paint shaper or the other end of a brush to do this as well. And again, I don't want to overthink the design, I'm just getting a design down there. This time I've gone for spirals, but you can use any shapes you want, and you can even use writing as well, so write into your page. And it's also quite handy to have a blank page to hand ready there for you to wipe off your scraped paint onto and get that page started as well. Time for the final tip. Tip number 12, stretch it out. So far we've been mostly covering our pages completely, but you don't have to. You can partially cover a page and add like a dry brush texture, or in this case a dry palette knife texture. And you do this by adding some paint to the surface, but not too much. Spread that paint out over part of the surface with your knife until you've got a nice thin layer. Now I'm using soft body for this and it works really well. And then you get to a point when, as you're moving your palette knife backwards and forwards over that paint, you're kind of stretching it across to the areas that you haven't already got paint. And that's what gives you that dry brush texture. And you only really need a very small amount of paint on your palette knife to get that texture. If you've got too much paint on your palette knife, you're just basically going to cover that area. This is one of those techniques you kind of need to try it to get the feel of it. So give it a go and let me know how you get on. So in that session, I managed to get 6 double pages started and 6 single pages started. What happens to the next, I'm not sure yet, but I'm sure I'll share with you what I do with them next. In the meantime, I hope some of these tips have been useful to you and that you have great fun trying them out yourselves. Have fun creating, and I'll see you next time.